computer. Okay. All right, so here we are, intentional communities, renamed from co-housing. So these are developed in accordance with the Danish model. All right, so let's see. So basically, it's going to be in three parts. What are intentional communities? So I'll try to describe what they are. There's 6 key components. And then part 2 is a 5-phase participatory process for sustainable neighborhood development. And basically what you need to know is it was originally developed for senior community development, but with some modification, it serves equally well for intergenerational community development. And then there's one intentional community that I've been working on, and I'll describe that. So to kind of put this all together, hopefully. So moving on, what is an intentional community? All right. Basically, it's a balancing act of development, marketing, and community. And so is it a hippie commune? And no, it's not. Okay. Is it a hippie commune? No, it's not that. Is it a collective farm? No. Is this what you had in mind? I've seen a lot of these things bombed lately on TV. Whatever you have in mind, forget about it. Leave all your preconceived notions behind. Let the journey begin anew. All right. So here's something. This is a front porch. This is a rather novel idea that turns out to be a very key piece of social engineering, or it's a social capital, if you will. All right. So intentional communities are a collection of private homes clustered around shared space. Each one of these homes, they're single family homes, they have all the traditional amenities. They're a complete home. But there's also shared spaces, such as a common house that may have a large kitchen. There's laundry, restrooms, recreational spaces for young and old, and shared outdoor spaces and parking, walkways, gardens, and neighbors may share resources like tools and lawnmowers. Or in some cases, you might have 12 homes and 1 lawnmower, all right? And the communities are rich and vibrant, all right? So this is a little town. This is Downeyville, California, population about 300, I believe. And everybody knows everybody. And that lady wearing the pink pants, she's no longer with us, but in her last few years, all of her neighbors waited on her, basically came in and made sure she was doing okay. We can replicate that in some intentional communities. Right? So there are 6 key components to intentional communities. The first one is participatory process, and that's what we're going to focus on in part 2. Deliberate neighborhood design, extensive common facilities, resident management, non-hierarchical structure, and separate income sources. These are not communes. So the participatory process, Henry Nielsen, a Dane, he developed this for the creation of intentional communities that recognize the needs of seniors. It's organized in 5 phases and is based on a proven participatory process. Since its inception, it's evolved into an established, efficient, and effective procedure for creating successful intentional communities. If you can remember one thing, remember this. It is only through this process that intentional communities have been built. Otherwise, they cost too much, take too long, create too much acrimony, or worst of all, don't work very well. Active member participation from the earliest planning phase through to construction is the most important component and sets it apart from any other type of community development. Organizing and planning intentional community requires time for group meetings, research, and decision-making. Most anything worthwhile requires time and effort. People organize themselves to build schools, town halls, etc. So why not a viable working neighborhood? Why should this process appeal to you? Well, you'll help organize and plan your own community. And you're also responsible for final decisions. So here's the inside of that little store we saw in Downeyville. So this kind of community relationship, this spirit of community, we can replicate that in an intentional community. Deliberate neighborhood design, okay, a physical environment that encourages strong neighborhood atmosphere is the second most important component. People express a desire to live where they know their neighbors and feel secure, yet few of these developments actually do that. So here's an example of some people getting together with a mentor, and they're actually designing their community. And they're starting with what they call the site design charrette. So beginning with the first plan, subscribers are brought to understand and work to emphasize those design features that increase the likelihood for social contact. And you basically do things like put the parking at the edge of the site, and that allows for more pedestrian-oriented development and therefore a safer environment. So that safety is enjoyed by everybody, seniors, the less able, and young children. Another picture of these people working on the design of their own community. Again, this is the site design. Because the community is really built in the planning phase, the design that ultimately gets built sustains the community for a long time. Why should this appeal to you? The physical layout of the community that you help design will encourage community. And given that few of the alternatives today have been designed with that in mind, why would you choose them? So here's the finished product. They've hammered through this design and they like it. Meanwhile, back in the common house, extensive common facilities. Well, each home was complete. Intentional communities have supplemental areas. Private homes are smaller because some features, like guest rooms, for example, would be located in the common house. If the single family home is designed to spread people out, the common house is designed to bring them back together and bridges the gap between home and neighborhood. Here's some al fresco dining next to the common house. So this is a common dinner. So the community gets together periodically to have dinners. So you'll basically volunteer, if you so desire, to cook for your neighbors every once in a while. The average US home at the start of this century was about 2,300 square feet. The average private home in an intergenerational community is just 1,250 square feet and only 950 square feet in a senior community. But to supplement all that stuff, in the average size of a common house in a 30-unit co-housing community, 4,000 square feet, including workshops and other common buildings. And here's some common areas, neighbors impromptu getting together. Okay, and this is the inside of the common house. This is where you'd have meetings. This is where you would dine. This is where you can put all the chairs to one side and dance, whatever. Here's a group of people getting together, volunteers, taking their turn every so often to cook dinner, clean up afterwards. Here's the various members of the community getting together for a common dinner. Here's the al fresco version when the weather's just right. And then they put all the chairs to one side and go for a dance. For some reason, this is a very popular activity in senior intergenerational communities. And then because of the way these things are designed, it's safe to have kids running around because they're not going to get run over. And people, different neighbors, different people get together, casually walk on the pedestrian walkways that connect all the facilities together, and they have these impromptu meetings, something that typically we don't get to do in this country very often. So again, while the single family home design consumes energy, time, and money, the common house conserves all three. Why should this appeal to you? These common areas will be an integral part of your community. You will help design them for daily use and they will supplement your private living areas. This is an example. They took one of the garages and turned it into a workshop. So that guy sitting there with the yellow shirt, that's Chuck. He says that these guys get together to get some beer and get a bunch of catalogs, and every so often they decide to pool their money and buy another tool. The other thing is that when they moved into this thing, everybody donated their tools at one time, and they had a complete workshop with just about every tool they needed. So resident management, in keeping with the spirit in which these communities are developed, residents are responsible for their ongoing management. There's no certified association managers. The residents do it themselves. Major decisions are made at common meetings, usually monthly. These meetings are the forum to discuss issues and solve problems. And these meetings would be basically attended by everybody, not just a board. There would be no board in this case. All right. No one person dominates the decision or the community building process, and no one person should become excessively taxed by that process either. And this, you'll see these different color cards. This is a consensus process by which people can go through a meeting, and a good facilitator can take a group of people through a meeting rather quickly once everybody knows how to use the cards. Right? Residents learn to work together to find optimal solutions and adopt those organizations developed by other groups to create new behaviors. You know, if I have an idea and you have an idea, together we'll have a third idea that's better than both of our original ideas. This is why working through the coach team building sessions is selected by a seasoned group facilitator is so important. Until the group experiences these things the sessions cover, they'll never transform themselves into a cohesive social group. So this would be like things like study group 1, where you learn these behaviors. And this is another one of these, a picture of some more people in the common house having a meeting. Why should this appeal to you? As a resident, you'll help manage development of your community. You'll help make decisions of common concern. Or would you rather just let somebody else do this for you? Sometimes it can be good, most of the time not. Non-hierarchical structures. Residents may state their opinions on issues, but the community shares responsibility. The community doesn't depend on any one person for direction. All right, and so again, there's not like there's a leader in this thing. It's not like there's a board of directors. It's kind of like a chaos, but if with the proper team building process, it works out rather well, or can. Another case where you're seeing all the people getting together having a meeting. There's lots of meetings. It's an important part of this. Why should this appeal to you? In these communities, there really aren't any leadership roles. The responsibility for the group's decisions are shared by all the community's adults. Another meeting. Separate income sources. These places are not communes. The economics are more or less like a condominium project. Why should this appeal to you? The residents all have their own primary incomes. The community generally does not generate income, although there are some that have a lot to do with agriculture. People have gardens, especially in California, where they grow vegetables and take them to, say, a farmer's market or something. Most times they eat that stuff themselves. All right. Regarding process, okay, most times today a developer will take the lead and build whatever he thinks will sell. In this type of development, the community members assume the role of developer, or they can actually hire one for a fee, and they build what they want. We'll get to that in part 2. Let's look at some benefits. All right. This is for a community in California, and they designed these things so that they were so energy efficient, that plus they had PV panels. They actually get money back from Pacific Gas and Electric in the summer months. And this is how they did it. And by the way, they installed even though the buildings were built by a contractor, as a social cohesiveness exercise, the co-housers themselves installed the PV panels after they moved in. And again, that front porch, social capital. So it's, these front porches are always located real close to one another on a pedestrian walkway so that people have all these little impromptu meetings. Okay, and these small houses don't necessarily have to feel small. One thing that happens is people move into these things and typically they downsize before they go into these things, and they don't have any problem. In fact, after a year, they say they wish they downsized more. Intentional community history. It got started in Denmark about 1980. The senior variety started about 4 years later. And in a country with a population of 5.6 million, there are about 600 senior intentional communities. That means that about one person in 50, one senior in 50 Danish seniors lives in one. Okay, and this is a picture. Now, I don't know which one this is. There's two of these pictures, and I'll see them one after the other. But this is a bunch of guys, a bunch of people sitting around having al fresco dinner, and they seem to be pretty happy. Now, let's look at the next one. This is a similar picture. Now, these two pictures were actually taken about 20 years apart in different, one of these is in the United States, and the other one is in Denmark. And everybody seems to be in a good mood. And somebody pointed out, says, well, yeah, now count the number of people and count the number of wine bottles, and now you know why they're in a good mood. But that's really not it, okay? So here we have a co-housing community. I believe this one's in Colorado, and they have some upstairs units and some downstairs units. When somebody gets to the point where they can no longer climb stairs, what they do is they'll do like some kind of swap where they're literally swap units. So the people who can no longer go upstairs will swap with someone downstairs who can go upstairs. And this is what their recreation is. I don't see any gin and tonics there. And then in the common house, people can take up different hobbies. In this case, this lady, I think she's doing curtains or something like that. I don't know what they're doing. Looks like it might be jewelry or something like that, but clubs, you can organize clubs in these communities. I guess these people are going to make cottage cheese. I'm not sure what that is. And then everybody always has plenty of time to get together and lounge around. And again, the front porch, the neighbors having coffee together. And then certain times when people are feeling a little under the weather, the neighbors can come over and help out. All right. So after moving in, one of the projects that these people get involved with is building a greenhouse. And then after they build it, of course, they have to celebrate getting it built and having some more wine. And then this is the kitchen in the common house. You notice it's big enough. It's not a commercial kitchen, but yet it's big enough that 4 people can work in it comfortably and not bump into one another. And then afterwards, you've got an opportunity for everybody to dine together. And then you have a meeting afterwards, in this case with wine. And this presumably would be the landscape committee. Landscaping is something that typically isn't done under the general contract. It's done by the community members themselves after they move in. So installing the landscape and maintaining it, these are community activities. So let's look at part 2. This is where the 5-phase participatory process. All right, this is important. This is the key thing. All right, so we have these 5 phases: feasibility, information, study group 1, the Getting It Built workshop, which is part of study group 1, or could be, study group 2, and study group 3. Now, in the States, because there's not a whole lot of understanding about intentional communities, what we do is we tend to mix these first 3 up. But once we get to study group 1 and the Getting It Built workshop, then everything gets back on track. All right, so again, I'll just reiterate this again. It's only through this process that these communities have been built. Otherwise, they cost too much, take too long, create too much acrimony, or worst of all, don't work very well at all. And so here's the development process. There's actually two tracks. There's a professional track. You hire consultants and they do this work up here. So feasibility study, design, construction, and the group track where you start off with a database of 25 interest community members, find a group, have orientation weekends. You have study group 1 and study group 2. That's design. This is where you do workshops where people learn to work together and build a cohesive community. Here's where that cohesive community starts to do its own design. And then during construction, that's when they do policy, which is basically writing up condo docs and stuff like that. So phase 1, is there enough interest in the community for an intentional community? So this is really hard. Understand that a developer is going to spend about 6% of his budget on promotion. And a lot of that's going to be through a real estate brokerage or something like this. In these types of communities, you're not going to be doing anything with a real estate brokerage or anything like that. This is up to the community itself. They have to do this promotion themselves. Will it be an intergenerational community or a senior community? If there's enough interest, a core group of about 15 to 25 adults will form. They should be able to identify a site, and they should have identified some financing options. Phase 2, information, spreading the word. Again, this is, people can run themselves ragged and it still won't be enough. Discuss development strategies. This phase starts with a well-publicized one-day meeting where interested individuals get an overview of all aspects of intentional community development. Often, once a group has gotten this far, it's best to schedule a Getting It Built weekend offered by experienced intentional community developers. And basically, it gets you all fired up. That's the most important part. Then you go phase 3, study group 1, okay? Aging successful, aging in place. There's 2 versions of these. There's one for seniors, there's one for intergenerational, and I'm going to go through quickly the one for the seniors. There are 10 topics, 10 weekly 2-hour sessions. Aging in place, aging in community, group process, realities of getting older, and going through all these different things. And eventually we get down to case studies. So aging in place, assessing the implications of our current quality of life and beginning to define what we want, getting out of denial and into self-determination. Group process, how to work together, learning new communication and decision-making skills, conflict resolution skills. You can do anything if you know how to work together. Realities of getting older, physical, mental, and psychological, raising awareness and planning for successful aging. Understanding our choices in receiving, sharing, and giving care, discussing the implications and setting guidelines for caring in a community, how to accommodate nurses and other caregivers as well as family. Co-healing, the role of others in keeping us healthy. The economics of getting older, the finances of various senior living arrangements. Philosophy, spirituality, and mortality. Nurturing continued growth and strengthening bonds by exploring issues of the spirit and soul. Saging, anyone can get old, but how many of us can become elders? What do we have to offer the world as we grow into elderhood? Embracing risk, staying where you are, moving back to a small town, moving in with the daughter, or moving into co-housing or an intentional community. Case studies, senior intentional neighborhoods, visit one. So basically the last one's kind of fun. You get to go to the nearest intentional community. Like here in, say in southern Wisconsin, you could drive over to Madison. They have a couple of communities there, all right? And then you get to the Getting It Built workshop, all right? It's a weekend-long event that answers these questions. What does the group need to do? In what order do they need to do it? What consultants do they need to hire to help them with these needs? And then people get really switched on by this workshop. Phase 4, study group 2. That's the participatory design process. Intentional community development begins with a participatory process that will sustain the community long after the honeymoon is worn off, and ends with blueprints for the physical community that will embody a neighborly approach to living while protecting individual privacy. So we start off with the design program. And that is, before we solve a problem, we have to first state it. So the order of design is site design, that'd be 1 or 2 weekends. Common house design, that's usually a weekend. Private house designs, that's a weekend. And then there's a fourth one where we go through and deal with finishes and decide what we can and cannot afford. And that's usually somewhat later after the architects are working up designs and working with contractors and stuff. So the design process. That's a design criteria are detailed requirements that provide the basis for the architectural design. The design program outlines the goals, activities, spaces, and characteristics desired by a resident group, and thus clarifies the criteria against which design alternatives will be evaluated. So the order of design, first we do site design. This is addressed first because its configuration relates to key questions about feasibility and design and will be required for the planning approval process. And typically the architect will dedicate 4 days to the group to establish this design criteria. And those can be 4 contiguous days or 2 separate weekends. And then what happens between this charrette, or these 2 charrettes, and the next charrette, a schematic site design will be prepared to present to the group. All right. So this is an example of a co-housing site plan. And you can see, if you can see here down at the lower left would be where the parking is. And then you're obliged to get into the community to actually go through a gate, which takes you right by the common house. And then you have these pedestrian walkways that take you to the individual homes. All right. This is another one that uses, there's some frontage that's commercial, and then back behind the frontage, you have some parking. And then to get into the community itself, you have to go by the co-housing, the common house, and that takes you, once you get past that, you can actually go to your individual homes. Again, here's some pictures of some people going through and designing their site. A little more work, they put a little more polish on it, and there they've come up and finished it. And then in the week between the site design charrette and the common house design charrette, the architects will draw this up and present it at the beginning of the next charrette. Then I'll have some nice color pictures, some renderings and stuff like that. And then at some point it might actually get built, right? Study group 2, this is the common house charrette. If the single family home is designed to spread people out, the common house is designed to bring them all back together. The common house bridges the gap between home and neighborhood. While the single family home design consumes energy, time, and money, the common house conserves all 3. So here's an example of Wolf Creek Lodge. This is in Grass Valley, California. This is the lower floor. So you can see there's an al fresco dining area out here, regular dining area in here, a lounge, some back of house spaces. Here's their laundry space, a guest room. And then you'll notice you can go upstairs, and what they've got up here are apartments. This actually is a senior intentional community. And so what they've done is there's a local nursing school, and they actually have low cost apartments for some of the nursing students so that they can have someone on site that can help them with medical care. All right. And then there's the private house design, which is 3 days. And there's no need to duplicate anything that's in the common house, like guest rooms or a laundry, although some people insist on having them anyway. To facilitate economical construction, the designs are limited to 4 or 5 house plans. And in some cases, you can get down to 2 or 3. And this is an example. It says, Well, you may not be handicapped now, but at some point you may be. And even though this individual wasn't actually confined to a wheelchair for real, they got to experience what it was like to turn around in a handicapped bathroom in a wheelchair. And so here's some people sitting around trying to figure out how to design their individual homes. Okay, while that's being done, okay, so you go through that whole process, and now the architects are putting together construction documents. They're going out soliciting bids, negotiating with contractors, getting permits, and actually getting the construction done. While all this is happening, this can go on for a year or more, that's when the group works on all these critical issues. They have to raise more money because you'll be spending money like crazy at this point. And you'll also have to, basically you're doing some really fancy condo docs at this point. And this is the process of creating the social community that makes co-housing or intentional communities vastly different from typical retirement communities. So during this process, the group gets together and actually gets to see their homes being built. Another case on site. And things are a little further along. The framers are out. And here's the finished community. So the other thing is you're looking at different things like policy. Okay, resident communities, committees. There's a bunch of these. Some are temporary, some last a long time. But they said outdoor maintenance, garbage room, vegetable garden, kitchen, common living room, laundry, workshop, and cleaning rules. There's also landscaping. Every once in a while, you have to go down and cut back the brush at the secret trail. All right. Changes during construction. Do not allow changes during construction. Allowing virtually no changes is the only way to avoid complicating the building process. Complications almost always mean additional costs and time. All right. Co-care agreements. Codified co-care issues should address who does what and when, and what each member commits to doing or not doing. Some of us just want to be neighbors. We'd rather not be caregivers. So these are things that you look at in study group 3. Moving in and setting up. So you set a date or a series of dates for people to move in. And after most have moved in, what do you do then? Okay. They have these different team building projects. Number one is to go out and buy and install the furniture and equipment in the common house. And presumably, as you've set this thing up, you've set some money aside to do that. The other one you can do is install the landscaping. And the third one is install the PV panels. I, as an architect, if I were to specify a PV panel setup, by the time the building gets built, everything that I specified would probably be obsolete. So it actually serves two purposes to do this later. One, it's a team building project, and two, you're getting the latest stuff. All right, so here's a case study. So this is, we're going to look at how much does it all cost? Well, they're hard and soft costs. How many households? Is it intergenerational? Is it senior? Is it rich? Is it poor? And bottom line, it can cost a lot because it's serious, and it's a lot more than a cluster of yurts in the woods. I literally had a group that thought they could get away with that. So this is one we're looking at, Lower Town Commons in Paducah, Kentucky. It's 10 to 12 households, and it's going to be organized via a homeowners association on purchased land. All right, so this is some pictures of it. This is just some outline stuff. Again, once you go through study group 2, which is a participatory design process, it may wind up not looking like this at all. But this is just an idea. These are the residential units here. There's these 6. It's actually, they're 3 floors tall with 1-bedroom units on the lower floor and 2-bedroom, 2-story units on the 2nd and 3rd floor. There's deeded parking along an alley. And then over that, you have a common house And over that, you have a greenhouse. And there's also a tower, since you have to have elevators and for handicapped people to get around, you might as well just go up another floor and have an observation tower. Right. So these are the areas. So we're looking at 1,300 square feet for a 2-bedroom. And we're looking at costs of $130 a square foot. So the unit cost, this is cost, this is not what you're going to pay for this. It's $169,000. All right. This is the 1-bedroom unit. You have the garages and you have the parking. So you can see how that breaks down. I think these are awfully low. Prices have been going up so quickly lately that these may be fiction. So here's our construction costs. Our property is $115,000. That is a real price. That's pretty cheap. The units are going to cost about 1.7 million. The common house is about another $500,000. The covered deeded parking altogether is about 150,000. The open deeded parking is about 8,000. So the total construction, 2.3 million. We're going to add a 5% contingency, which brings the total construction with contingency to about 2.5 million. We're going to add the land in, it'll get us about 2.6. All right, so there are also some soft costs. Those were the hard costs. So we have a geotech survey, $3,000 allowance. We're going to have to pay for study group 1. We're going to have for a co-housing advisor, the getting it built weekend. Study group 2, the design team, the construction manager, permits and fees, property taxes. You're going to have to pay property taxes on this stuff while it's being built. Study group 3, basically this is where you're writing up your condo docs. And then there's your total soft costs, right? And so what happens, this describes what all these things are, the geotech survey, you have to determine the soil bearing capacity. We don't have to do perk tests or anything because we'll be hooking up to the sewer system. Study group 1, go through this to establish the necessary social cohesiveness. And there's going to be a co-housing advisor. This is strongly advised because there are just too many unknowns that a group will encounter that could undermine even the best efforts of the most talented people. So they're up to 50 legal instruments that need to be negotiated at specific times. The getting it built weekend, usually that's the same person that serves as the community's co-housing advisor. This can be scheduled before or after the co-housing advisor has been retained. Study group 2, $20,000 allowance, maybe more than that. And that's where you actually design your own, you establish all the design criteria for your own community. And then you have the design team, includes the architect of record and their consultants. And that team's deliverables will include the project's construction documents. And the team will also administer the construction contract to make sure that the contractor builds the scope of work as defined in the construction documents. And then the construction manager is someone that's basically hired that knows the local market really well, knows prices, and can help ensure that everything stays within certain guidelines. Permits and fees, and these will vary, but it's usually based on some unit price per $1,000. Property taxes, once the property is owned by the community, taxes have to be paid. Study group 3, typically a legal team is hired to work closely with the co-housing advisor to modify the various legal instruments needed to align with local codes, etc. So your total costs, hard and soft costs, and combined 2.8 million. Capital invested is about 650,000. Most lenders require communities to invest an amount equal to 23% of the total cost before they're allowed to make draws against their construction loan. So the construction loan would be about 2.2 million. The interest could be 300,000. So the total costs with interest are 3.1 million. All right, so now we have to apportion all these costs, all these additional costs across all the units. So we're looking at land alone. The land, it's about $10,000 per unit. Even the parking, $1,300 a unit. Common elements would be the common house, $30,000 per unit for the 2 bedrooms. Different soft costs, those also have to be apportioned. So they're pretty pricey. It's $25,000 just for the soft costs. Interest expenses, I don't know if it'll be that high, but just an idea. Total cost plus apportionments. So we're looking at the 1 bedroom, which cost $169,000 to build. With the apportionments, it's $263,000. Right now, we have to have administration costs that have to be apportioned as well, and these costs help offset risky early money premiums, in-kind reimbursements, incidental expenses, to fund community investment pool to pay for landscaping and subsidize below market rate units if there are any. In this case, the rate is equal to 9% of the total cost plus apportionments. So this adds $23,000 to the cost of a 2-bedroom and so on. Once you add these costs together, that's when you get the unit price. So a 2-bedroom unit that cost $169,000 to build has to be sold for $287,000 in order for all this stuff to make even. All right, so essentially this is a kind of a schedule. Months 1 to 6, that's the due diligence studies and property acquisition. People pay for this out of their own pocket. There's monthly assessments. So if you want to be part of it, you want to get on this train and get aboard, you have to pay the tickets, right? Study months 7 to 10, you got study group 1, getting it built workshop, and the participatory design workshops, again, paid for out of pocket. Months 11 to 18, bidding and negotiation, construction, contract, study group 3, policy. Members will continue to pay for things until they've collectively invested about 23% of the total project costs. And then they'll start making draws on the loan. So intentional community shorts, just some stories. People get together, they play music. Sometimes they'll trade instruments and stuff like that. Again, people getting together in the common house and dancing. Here's some folks, the landscape committee trying to make the lawn look nice. Here's a kid, this guy, I think he's a quadriplegic, I can't remember, but in this community, everybody gets to play. The kids in these intergenerational communities tend to watch TV very little because there's lots of kids to play with, and it's a pretty safe environment to play. So kids tend to socially interact more often because their parents are socially more active. And so the kids there's like, none of the kids get left behind. This guy here on the left is Chuck. He's one of these people that designs these communities. This happens to be a senior co-housing community. And after, usually about a year after they move in, he'll come around and visit and does he participates in something called a post-occupancy evaluation. And the number one piece of feedback that he gets from most everybody is that they wish they had downsized further, that they wish they had gotten rid of more of their junk. The reason is that they find that socially interacting with other people is more important than owning stuff. So this is the Hearthstone community. Now this is an interesting story. This really happened. It's a catalyst. This Hearthstone community is a catalyst to a larger new urbanist neighborhood. How could that be? Okay, these are the protagonists. This is Jim Leach, Wonderland Hill Development, a co-housing developer. He lives in Boulder, Colorado. This is Jonathan Rose. He's the largest not-for-profit affordable housing developer in the country based out of New York City. And this is his brother-in-law, Peter Calthorpe, and he is one of the founders of the Congress of New Urbanism. All right, so this is a story. This this here, this Highlands Garden Village actually is part of the old Denver Stapleton Airport, which was real close to what's considered downtown Denver. So it's really very valuable property. They built the new airport out in the prairie about halfway to Nebraska. But this valuable real estate, they said it had to be developed. They wanted to develop some sort of community there. So they hired Jonathan Rose and Peter Calthorpe to kind of do the master plan. And so this is what they came up with. And then right down here, you have 38 intergenerational community households. These were actually developed by that guy, Jim Leach. And what he did during one of the meetings, there was a series of publicly attended charrettes. And during one of the open mic sessions, he went up to the mic and he said, he told everybody there, if you allow me to develop an intergenerational community in here, in your community, it'll serve as a catalyst to the rest of the community. Now, he actually told me this story in person. And when he did, he winked at me. He says, you know, at the time I was making that up, but I was pretty sure I was right. So this is the Hearthstone community that was built within that. And indeed it was, and it is, the catalyst to a larger new urbanist development. What happened was, after this thing was built, not this one, but the whole community, they came out with a community newsletter. And that community newsletter always shows pictures of people walking around and stuff like that. Well, it turns out most of those pictures were actually taken in the Hearthstone community. And the question is why? And the answer is fairly obvious. It's, well, because that's where the life is. So that's how that works. Now, new urbanism is an interesting thing. I spent about, I don't know, a little over a decade as a new urbanist, and we were busy. I was working with other architects and we were designing all these places. We thought we knew everything, and every one of these communities kind of didn't feel right. And the reason was that they didn't go through, the people that lived there didn't go through a process of social cohesiveness building or anything like that. So they didn't go through a study group one. There's a limit to how many people can be in one of these intentional communities. But the point is that the intentional community is formed socially before they actually design the place they're going to be. And again, here's an example. These are the front porches of one of these communities. And you'll notice that the front doors are, about, in this case, it looks like they might be about 25, 30 feet apart if you go across the walkway. So senior services, this is another interesting, this is interesting. There have been several research grants that funded studies that looked at all these things. One of the most recent include one that was hosted by the Seaside Institute. When these were compiled, the assumption was that most would need to be provided for or facilitated by county level governments or non-governmental agencies. To some extent, many are already being provided or facilitated, but given that resources are limited, it's unlikely that they can be ramped up sufficiently to meet the looming tsunami of demand generated by baby boomers. All right, we're retiring at 10,000 per day. So a proven alternative is for seniors to organize themselves to provide these services to one another. This alternative is intentional community development. So here's the original vision board. I was there when this was done at the Seaside Institute, and we came up with all this. Is a 30A Alliance for Aging with Grace. So we had this is their vision. People will have great quality of life. And at the time, the person that did this didn't know anything about intentional communities. And then afterwards, I basically gave her the presentation that you just had. And it was like she woke up. So anyway, we look at these things, and there's all these different, there's 17 different types of services. And every one of these services can be provided to some extent in an intentional community by the community members themselves. So let's look at a few of these. There are 4 categories: community and neighborhood support, design issues, medical care, transportation. So let's look at this one, community events and programs, all right? Well, in an intentional community with a common house, that's something that they can do themselves, all right? Access to technology. There's an issue with senior people have a hard time dealing with computers. Well, we can fix that in a common house, all right? Senior resources, different things like being able to have books with larger print or something like that. Volunteer network. Instead of actually getting from volunteers from outside the community, volunteers can be taken from within the community. And they're going to have shared meals in the common house. And there's always this protection from fraud. Design issues, silver architecture. We don't need as many stairs. We're adverse to stairs. We need to have bathrooms that are big enough so that we can turn around in a wheelchair. Smart design. Sense of protection, guest accommodations. We can take care of those even in our own house, or we can have them stay in a guest room in the common house. Medical care, telemedicine support. So in some cases, they'll have in the common house, they might actually have a room for caregivers to actually meet with patients. Assisted living dementia care, that can actually be accommodated rather than going into an assisted living facility or a nursing home. These things can actually be provided by the community itself in the community. On-site care, acute care facilities, in some cases, this can be done within the community. Caregiver accommodations. So for example, I showed you in that Wolf Creek facility in Grass Valley, they actually had apartments that they rented to some of the local nursing students and the life care, right? And then we have transportation, ride sharing, Uber rides, and then these are the two books. If you want to learn all about co-housing, intentional communities, what have you, this is the source. And then there's a book here. This is basically how to run a charrette. And this is something called problem seeking, which is actually defining a problem before we actually solve it. This is a big deal in architecture. And so that's basically it. Here's another set of books. Here's some books take you through study group 1. Here's Chuck's latest book. Here's another book that they just did, Happily Ever After in Co-Housing. So that's it. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks, George. This has been a really great presentation. You know, you talked about lots of meetings and you talked about a lot of time on front porches and stuff. This sounds kind of exhausting. Can you say something about, you know, time commitment both before the community is built and then people living together as well? What kind of engagement or is expected or needed?
Well, at times during the development process, it can really be very taxing. And so much so that, especially if you don't have a good co-housing advisor, the people can start to drop out. So people have to understand from the onset that you're going to be spending a lot of time, maybe as much as 10 hours a week, putting this all together at some point. It won't be like that the entire time. Once you get past study group 2, which is the design charrettes, it'll fall off rather quickly. So the part that's really hard, the part where you're that guy Sisyphus or whatever pushing that rock up the hill, that's during the development process. And like I say, bank on 10 hours a week to get it done right. Once you move in, and once things are moving along, you're talking about maybe 1 or 2 hour meetings once a week at most. And the other thing is that they break these things up into committees so that certain things, certain topics are researched and discussed, and then recommendations are given to a larger meeting. So the larger meetings may be once a month, and the committee meetings might be once a week until they've dealt with the problem. So the difference is that, like, I know people that live in condominiums, and so they've got this. This is by no means typical, but in their case, they had a condominium manager, a homeowners association manager, and then they had a condo board. And so people get elected to the condo board, and they had this thing where there were a couple of houses in this facility. I guess they're townhouses, and they were flooded, and the people that lived in them didn't have insurance or something. I don't know what the story was, but these things came up for sale, and they were uninhabitable. And what happened was, because they were cheap and because the insurance company wanted to get rid of them, the community bought them. And so turns out the community association manager, the CAM, whom they hired, who was a person on salary, they had a relationship with the contractor. And so they were looking to say, well, let's rebuild these things. And they had all sorts of common funds that they'd set aside through their assessments. And they rebuilt these two units. I don't know, I'm guessing they were probably 2-bedroom condos. Well, the prices that came in were astronomically high, but the condominium association manager told the condo board, oh, well, these are really good prices. Well, basically, everybody was just being ripped off. And I found out, like, one of the prices, for example, was they said, well, they had to change out one of the air handlers because when this place was flooded, apparently water got into it and it was destroyed. So they were saying, well, to replace the air handler is $130,000. Now, I happen to know for a 2-bedroom condo, an air handler, just the physical machine itself should probably not be more than $3,000. And installing it should probably be no more than $1,000. And then maybe you might add in the ductwork or something like that, might have to replace that. But all of that together would be less than $10,000. And these people were expected to pony up $130,000, right? In a co-housing community, in an intentional community where you're doing your own management, you should know these things. You'll know these things. It's not like you have a board. It's not like there's somebody representing you. You're there. You're responsible. You're asking these questions, and you're not moving until you get answers. So yeah, you're spending more time, but look at what you're in charge of. You're responsible for stuff, and you're not getting ripped off. That's the whole point.
Okay, thanks. And is there any kind of like demographic or values amongst people who come together in co-housing intentional communities? If I go into one, should I expect to find a certain type of person there?
Well, actually, no. I mean, there are communities. There's a community, for example, in Oklahoma, where all of the community members are Republicans. And a lot of people would assume that people that go into these intentional communities be somewhat left of center. That's not necessarily the case. What they've found is that the more diverse a community is, the more successful it is. And that's pretty much across the board. So there's some very successful communities, both on the West Coast and one in particular in Boston, which is extremely diverse. And there's so many of these. It's just like if you go to the Amazon jungle, there's all these different types of species and stuff. And that diversity is what makes that a very rich and vibrant community. All right. And it's the same if you got all these different kinds of people. So this one in Boston, it turns out, I think only one of the members of the community actually was born and raised in the United States. Everybody else came from somewhere else in the world, and they all came from different countries. Some from Africa, some from Europe, some from China, whatever, the Far East. And there's somebody go on the West Coast, and something like half the people in these communities come from some other country. And it's gotten to the point where graduate students are starting to study this stuff. And so there was this one community, and I went to this intentional community gathering, and we were all, discussing different things. And this guy said, well, these students came and they were investigating our community. And they said, well, we understand that, these communities can be kind of diverse. And so they said, well, how diverse are you? And the guy looked at him like they were crazy. And he said, we thought about it for a bit. And he said, well, we all drive Subarus, but they're all different colors. So much for that kind of diversity. But yeah, diversity is important. So will you find people like yourselves? Not necessarily, but that's the point is you go through that study group 1, the social cohesiveness building exercises, and these things become less important.
Okay, and one more question. So there's all these pictures of these people on their front porches and they're socializing and stuff, and I'm really kind of an introvert. I'm not sure if I want that much socialization. Would intentional community be right for me?
Well, I think so. In fact, when they go through and they study these, you talking about whether you might find someone like yourself, they actually found that the majority of people that go into these intentional communities would rate themselves as introverts. And now the thing is, the way these places are designed, yes, you have the front porch, you have the public side of your own private home, but you also have a private side. So there's like a front porch. There's also kind of like a back porch. There's a living room that's back there. So you can have as much or as little privacy as you want. So if you want to be out on display in your front porch, you can. Otherwise, you can close the blinds and go out back. You don't have to be on display all the time. What happens over time is that some people actually enjoy this.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate the presentation.
All right, I'm glad you liked it. I'm going to shut off this thing now. Let's see.